the conversations all day. Nigeria Info.
Let's talk.
On 993 and in.
Studio. Welcome back to Borderlines, the only show that takes you beyond borders. So yes, we had some technical problems, but we were able to get through that conversation with Kakwenzi he's not in Uganda, he was in Germany, but he's from Uganda. And as you know, when it comes to Africa, there's always so much to talk about. Apologies, I couldn't answer all your calls, but we move to my next guest. Right, again, we're going all the way to Gaza. Indeed, we're going to be talking Gaza again. As you know, this is a crisis. The Gaza war, which is now, there is no argument. Well, there are still those who are arguing it. But indeed, scholars and historians, both Jewish, American, international, Holocaust experts, most of them have now concluded that what is going on in Gaza is a genocide. I don't want to waste any more time. So much, even today, so much has happened. I have a special guest with me who is much more of an expert than I am. His name is Mouin Rabbani. He's a Middle East analyst and the co-editor of Jadaliyya. Mouin, am I pronouncing your name right?
You're pronouncing everything right. Thank you
wow,
for the
yes.
introduction, and it's very good to be with you.
No, the pleasure is ours. Thank you so very much for being with us. So much has happened. Like even just today, this afternoon, so much has happened. But before I go there, before we even get too much in, a development came out this week. And I remember seeing you talking about it on Facebook on another show. I can't remember the name of the show. And it's a name that the world, at least certainly those of us who have been following this, and a lot of my listeners, we have listeners all over the world who had been following this, were not familiar with, or at least didn't know was involved. So I'd like you to kind of unpack that for us and why that name has come up now, and what's the relevance of the man, Bishara Baba. Dr.
Yes.
Bishara Baba.
So Dr. Bishara Bahbah is a Palestinian American. He obtained his doctorate from Harvard University when it still existed as a proper university. I think one needs to add these days. And he, in fact, wrote his doctoral thesis on Israeli relations with Latin American terror regimes during the 1970s and 1980s. More recently, he led an organization or was in the leadership of an organization known as Arab Americans for Trump. So he's a Republican activist in the US. And it seems that in recent months, the Hamas movement in Palestine reached out to him to seek to make a connection with the Trump administration so that there would be more rational communications between them. And the reason this is relevant is that it needs to be understood that Bahbah was not a negotiator. He was not a mediator. He was a messenger. He was taking proposals provided to him by Hamas to the Americans and counter proposals provided to him by the Americans to Hamas. And at a certain point, he communicated an American proposal to Hamas that Hamas accepted. Israel then pulled out all the stops to seek to get the Americans to change the contents of this proposal, which the Americans duly did. And then, as they have done repeatedly, the Americans turned around and blamed Hamas for not accepting the proposal and suggested that there had been miscommunication or that Hamas had agreed to a proposal by Bahbah that had not been made by the Americans. But this is all transparently false because Bahbah's role is indisputably that of a messenger, not of a mediator. He's not proposing formulas. He's communicating them to the parties involved. And it would, of course, be very useful if either Bahbah or the other mediators, Qatar and Egypt, would come out and set the record straight on what actually happened. But for each of them, their priority is to maintain their relations with Washington, to remain in Trump's good graces. So they're not going to embarrass either the US president or his envoy, Steve Witkoff.
When you say, and this is why it's also even more curious, Bakba, now I pronounce it properly, thanks to you, Dr. Bakba was the head of Arab Americans for Trump. Was he in touch with Hamas at that time, or was Hamas in touch with him at that time? I mean, did they know each other? Did they have a history?
My understanding is that Hamas initiated communications with him, presumably through a mutual contact or acquaintance, after the January ceasefire broke down in March. What happened is that the Trump administration, in sharp contrast to the administration, for real, I say multi-year, January for Trump's office, when it came to negotiating the second stage of this agreement, Israel backed out, and Witkoff then double-crossed Hamas by putting forward proposals that contradicted what Hamas and Israel had already agreed to and were in the process of implementing. Hamas rejected those amended proposals. The U.S. then authorized Israel to resume and intensify its genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip and to impose the worst siege since the beginning of this campaign upon the Gaza Strip, where not a single drop of water, a single drop of fuel, a single aspirin, a single grain of wheat was permitted into the Gaza Strip. And it seems that it was in that context of seeking to find a new channel of communication in order to reach a new formula for agreement that Hamas initiated communications with Bahbah in order to have a line to the U.S. administration. Because it's also worth noting, as you may recall, that at one point, a different U.S. envoy, Adam Buller, went to Qatar and met directly with the Hamas leadership. And this left Israel apoplectic. You know, how dare they communicate directly with our enemies? And even more importantly, how dare they do this and reach and negotiate with them without even our knowledge or coordinating with us?
It's interesting. So, oh gosh, I really wished I could chat with you for 2 hours. In fact, I had when I put out the flyer that you are coming on today, there had been a discussion going on a particular group about Hamas. So I've got to ask you the question. This, you know, it's as you know, Hamas is polarizing, to put it nicely, and there are those who ask the question, right? What was Hamas's strategy for October 7th? And I don't mean to drag us back. I just want us to kind of create, because we're talking about the Nakba now. What was Hamas's strategy for October 7th? And even more so, are Palestinians still in support of Hamas?
Well, my answer is going to be speculative. I mean, we do have statements by Hamas about what their objectives were, but I think, as with any political statement by political leadership, one has to approach these with a healthy dose of skepticism. My own interpretation is that, of course, you can't understand October 7th without understanding the period before October 7th. And we had this unprecedented campaign to marginalize and isolate the Palestinians, a 16-year, 17-year blockade of the Gaza Strip imposed by Israel, where, you know, even children's toys and children's cookies and pasta and so on were prevented entry into the Gaza Strip. We had a openly annexationist agenda of successive Israeli governments. They were increasingly encroaching on Haram al-Sharif and East Jerusalem more generally. And then you had the Biden administration, which was focusing very much like its predecessor, the first Trump administration, on Arab-Israeli normalization, not in order to resolve the question of Palestine, but in order to permanently remove the question of Palestine from the regional and international agenda and to make the West Bank safe for Israeli annexation. So, my interpretation in response to your question is that Hamas on October 7th sought to irrevocably shatter the status quo, to make business as usual impossible. I don't think they anticipated that Israel would be permitted by its sponsor in Washington to unleash an openly genocidal campaign and to conduct it for as long as it has been permitted to by the United States, because in previous instances, Washington would typically at some point call Israel to order and instruct it to stop. But the problem here is that the president at the time, Joe Biden, was a lifelong, devoted, passionate Zionist who, as we now know, was in the process of completely losing his marbles. But the one principle that he remained completely cognizant of was his passionate attachment to Israel, and imposed absolutely no restraints on its actions. You know, the recently departed Israeli ambassador to Washington, Michael Herzog, in fact, in an exit interview, said as much. He said, you know, we were expecting that at some point Biden would order us to stop, but he never asked us to. Regarding the second half of your question, Palestinians have always been divided in their loyalties to different Palestinian political movements, and particularly since 2006, 2007, the Palestinian political arena has also been deeply polarized. And what I would argue is that I think since October 7th, Palestinian support for Hamas has most likely increased significantly on account of what was seen as its success in launching this unprecedented attack in Israel against not only population centers, but also key military installations. But I suspect that in the intervening 18, 19 months, that support has probably fallen back, and probably fallen back more in the Gaza Strip than elsewhere. But again, those are, I think, speculative responses to your very pointed questions.
Absolutely, and they work. Let's talk about the Nakba now. When I do my research, the last, or should I say, the first massacre that I come across is 1937, the Haifa massacre. However, we talk about the, almost 80 years. So that's almost 8 decades. 8 decades of the Nakba. Today, or at least since Donald Trump has become president, we're seeing another Nakba in motion. We're seeing Donald Trump, literally saying he has this idea of a Riviera. Clearly, He doesn't understand what a Nakba means. He doesn't understand the trauma that comes with such a language. We're seeing increased ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. We are now seeing incredibly insane Israeli, impunity in Gaza itself. Talk to us about that trauma. I mean, again, Haifa massacre, 1937. Jerusalem massacre, 1937. Balad al-Sheikh massacre, 1939. Haifa. I could go on and keep counting, and it goes on and on. Where does it stop? I don't even know what question to ask you anymore, because it does, the passion. I mean, you have to be inhuman not to feel passionate about this.
Well, since I'm speaking to a journalist with an audience of another former British colony, let me explain it this way: that Zionism could never have come to fruition. It would have ended up as another utopia or dystopia, call it what you will, discarded in the dustbin of history, had it not been for the British and their seizure of Palestine at the conclusion of the First World War, and their occupation of that country for 2 decades, in which they had an explicit policy of establishing what they called a Jewish national home in Palestine. I won't get into the details, but the British view was very much, in reference to Northern Ireland, that we need to create a Jewish Ulster in the Middle East to serve our interests, not only in the region, but also specifically to ensure control of the jugular vein of the British Empire, the Suez Canal, which was a key communications node to the crown to the crown jewel in the empire, namely India. So one cannot explain the success of Zionism, the establishment of the State of Israel, without the absolutely critical, central, indispensable role played by what the preeminent Palestinian historian Walid Khalidi referred to as the British Shield. And as you correctly note, the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, during which more than 75% of all Palestinians residing in territory that became the State of Israel during the late 1940s and early 1950s, has been the absolutely defining moment of contemporary Palestinian history. And now, as you note, 8 decades later, a very similar proposal is being explicitly discussed in the halls of power. Washington has explicitly proposed it. Israel has, through the mouth of its leader, the head of government, Benjamin Netanyahu, has stated that implementing this harebrained proposal is the explicit objective of what Israel is now doing in the Gaza Strip. And Israeli society as a whole has shifted so far to the extreme right that a majority of Israelis now support not only the expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip and the expulsion of Palestinians from the West Bank, but even the expulsion of Palestinian citizens of Israel. In other words, those who live within Israel's internationally recognized boundaries and who supposedly have equal rights of citizenship within this apartheid entity.
In the last 10, 12 weeks, Israel has weaponized humanitarian aid. And we talk about the last 10, 12 weeks, but I always like to take people back to the last ceasefire. The agreement of the last ceasefire in phase 1 was for Israel to not only allow humanitarian aid, but also to allow medicines, tents, mobile living equipment.
Correct.
And all these things. So people often forget that because so much happened in between that, you get shifted into the one that's currently going on. And now America and Israel, they've come up with this plan. We saw Israel expel UNRWA. We see them constantly campaigning against the UN, practically calling the UN an extension of Hamas. Israel is now saying explicitly, exactly. Israel is now saying that, look, we've done our humanitarian aid. We've brought in, some. I think I read in Times of Israel, they claim they've served 2 million food sort of packages in the last 24, 48 hours. What would you say to that?
Well, first, let me clear up a misconception. Israel never provided aid to the Palestinians. Israel was never asked to provide humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. Rather, the demand on Israel is to seek prohibiting the entry of essential, vitally needed humanitarian supplies into the Gaza Strip by others, by the United Nations, by World Central Kitchen, by Norwegian Refugee Council, and a variety of other humanitarian organizations. And since March the 2nd, as I noted, Israel has refused to permit the entry of a single drop of water, a single loaf of bread, a single aspirin, a single drop of fuel into the Gaza Strip. And what happened is that Israel, with U.S. support, in recent months has developed what it calls an alternative aid mechanism, which has the Orwellian title of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which was run by an exorbitantly paid U.S. mercenary answerable directly to the U.S. military. And this was not an aid mechanism. Its purpose was not to provide aid, but to restrict aid, to weaponize aid by offering these meager packages in the extreme south of the Gaza Strip to force Palestinians living elsewhere to make the trek to the southern Gaza Strip, to concentrate them on the Egyptian border, where once a week they could go to this distribution center through checkpoints where a number of them have already been kidnapped and receive packages that were supposed to last them a few weeks and then have to make the trek once again. Now, this mechanism was categorically rejected by the United Nations and every other genuine humanitarian or aid agency, and even the exorbitantly paid mercenary who was put in charge of this mechanism ended up resigning. So imagine, this thing was such a sham that even an exorbitantly paid mercenary refused to continue heading it. And the idea, quite explicitly, as the Israelis have themselves said, was to concentrate the population of the Gaza Strip along the Egyptian border so that they could eventually be forced out.
And this is the thing so with President Trump, the outrage, everybody responded literally calling him an ignorant so-and-so. Everybody, and for once we had the Arab governments literally rise up and say, you can't do this. We don't want this. But Israel, as you said, continues to try to push the Palestinians towards Egypt. What are the Arabs? Because the Egyptians came up with a plan for Gaza with the other Arabs, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. And yes, we may be, I think accusing them of having forked tongues is a fair criticism. However, since then, what should we be expecting from them? What have they done? We saw Saudi Arabia and the Arabs meet with the EU. What are they doing? What is going to change from that meeting? Are they going to do ordeal like Europeans? Or would they actually go into action?
Well, I think we have to understand that in 2025, all these Arab governments you're referring to are very closely tied to Washington. They're essentially Western client regimes, which have very little room for maneuver and even less desire to maneuver. And as long as Israel was slaughtering Palestinians in their homeland, they assumed the role of inert spectators. They literally didn't offer a single loaf of bread to the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip unless they first acquired Israeli and U.S. permission to do so. What changed this February is that Trump announced this harebrained proposal, not a plan, just kind of a verbal proposal, to forcibly relocate the entire Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip to Egypt and other Arab countries, and by implication to thereafter do the same with the Palestinians in the West Bank. So this transformed it from a question of Israel slaughtering Palestinians in their homeland to exporting this whole issue to the Arab world, which was seen particularly by Egypt, but also by other Arab governments, as a direct threat to their national security, as a direct threat to their domestic stability, as a direct threat to what remains of their legitimacy. And it was in that context that they openly and very vocally rejected this plan and stated that they would not accept any resolution that involved forcibly deporting Palestinians to their own countries. Now, you're quite right to focus on the quite nefarious role that is being played by the Trump administration. But I think equally we have to understand that Trump essentially picked up where Biden left off. And I think the primary blame for this entire horrific um, uh, experience of the past 2 years needs to be laid firmly, not at the door of Trump, but at the door of the United States, because what you see in US policy is primarily one of continuity rather than one of change.
Indeed. And since you say that, it wasn't even part of my questions, but we always ask the question, why does America care so much about Israel? Why is Israel literally the 51st state, of America?
It's a very good question, and I think there are multiple reasons. Let's first recall that it wasn't always this way. During the 1950s and 1960s, Israel's key international sponsor was not the United States, it was France. Israel acquired its nuclear program, its nuclear weapons, courtesy of Paris, not Washington. That all began to change during the 1960s, and particularly after the June 1967 war, when Israel, in the space of just 6 short days, defeated three conventional Arab armies, two of whom were close allies of the Soviet Union, and one of whom, Egypt, had been the standard bearer of pan-Arabism and Arab nationalism. This at a time when the U.S. was getting beaten into oblivion in Southeast Asia and Vietnam. Um, and so Israel proved its value as a proxy, as a strategic asset, as a regional custodian of U.S. interests in the Middle East at the height of the Cold War. And I think it's from there that we need to understand the closeness of the US-Israeli relationship as it developed in the 1970s and 1980s. After the Cold War, things began to change, but what you see is that US interests in the Middle East are primarily, concerning the Persian Gulf, Iraq, Egypt, and so on. And, Palestine is not a significant issue for the Americans. So on that issue, it lets Israel have its way, certainly with the Palestinians, but also with the Americans themselves. The absolutely bizarre reality today is that you can get up in Times Square in New York and you can criticize the United States, you can condemn the United States, you can call for the dismantlement of the United States, you can call for the destruction of the United States, and that will be considered free speech. But God forbid you go to Columbia University and start protesting Israel's genocide, and you will be sent to a dungeon in Louisiana, and they will try to strip you of your visa and of your residency rights and deport you and so on. So yes, Israel does have this sacred status in the United States that even the United States itself does not have.
Indeed. When, before I even go to my next question, in, July 2024, the ICJ ruled that Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories, the West Bank and Gaza Strip, everywhere included, was illegal. Not only did they rule that, they also ruled that Palestinians had a right and must be given their lands back. They were unequivocal. Every single judge was majority, ruled for that. In addition to that, they ruled that Palestinians must be compensated. Why is nobody talking about that? Why hasn't, even though that ruling went to the UN, and yes, the UN ruled for it, in favor of it, but we don't hear anything about it. It's almost like a ruling by the International Criminal Court. Doesn't matter.
Well, it's a very important issue you're raising, and I would answer it in two parts. The first part is that what we've demonstrated, particularly visibly since October 2023, is that Israeli impunity is an absolutely central principle of American and European foreign policy. And the United States and the European Union are quite happy to dismantle the international order and to participate in the destruction of international legal institutions in order to preserve Israeli impunity and to ensure that Israel is never held accountable for its actions. That's now clear as daylight. That's why we're talking about the end of the international order as we've known it since the end of the Second World War. Regarding this particular ruling you mentioned, it's actually an advisory opinion. And what that means is that it was the United Nations General Assembly, in other words, the international community is properly constituted, not the international community, the alternative international community, which consists solely of Washington and Brussels. The United Nations General Assembly asked the International Court of Justice to offer its opinion on the legality of continued Israeli rule in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. And as you note, in July of last year, the court ruled unequivocally that while occupation is a legal status under international law, Israel is engaged in a process of irreversible annexation, which violates the fundamental principles of international law, and that Israeli rule in any form in these territories is therefore illegal, unlawful, and illegitimate, and must be brought to as rapid a conclusion as possible, and instructed UN member states, all of them, to ensure that none of their actions or relations with Israel in any way help Israel continue its rule in these territories, and as you know, also call for reparations to the Palestinians for the damages inflicted. Now, it's called an advisory opinion, which is a technical term for any ruling that is issued in response to a request by the United Nations General Assembly. But the ruling is, in fact, binding upon not only UN institutions, but also all UN member states. But as you note, the West has basically pretended this ruling doesn't exist and continued with business as usual. You have the International Criminal Court indictments, as you referred to, of the Israeli Prime Minister and his former defense minister. Nevertheless, Greece and France are giving Netanyahu overflight rights on his way to yet another hero's welcome in the United States. I mean, can you imagine, Charles Taylor or Vladimir Putin being given similar privileges? Absolutely not. And this is because, as I mentioned, Israeli impunity has become a fundamental principle of Western foreign policy. And if it requires the destruction of international institutions and international legal institutions, they're quite happy to burn them to the ground to preserve this principle.
Which then makes you wonder, how is it they all managed to stand up to the Nazis? But that's a whole different discussion.
Yes.
Right. So right now, Hamas is in court actually fighting against their prescription in the United Kingdom of being
Correct.
called terrorists. They're saying that, look, you can't call us a terrorist. We've never acted outside of our country. We are resistance fighters. We are fighting for our people, and we have the right to fight for our people. First of all, what are your thoughts on that? Number one. Number two is, how likely do you think they would win that? Or is that going to be some sort of political games going on behind the scenes?
We just talked about the principles of Western approaches to this issue. And so I would be extraordinarily surprised if this legal challenge to the designation of Hamas as a terrorist organization by the United Kingdom succeeded. Nevertheless, I think it's an interesting case and potentially politically valuable because it forces a number of issues to be discussed in public. Israel and its apologists have this tendency of basically making the argument Israel has done nothing wrong. The Palestinians have no legitimate grievances, and they certainly don't have any legitimate rights. And the only way to understand what the Palestinians are doing is through the prism of anti-Semitism and Jew hatred. In other words, what is at work here is an irrational hatred of a group of people on the basis of their identity, not resistance to a state on the basis of its settler colonial and actions and its apartheid and its genocide. But you know, you look at the record as you mentioned. Hamas does not have a record of attacking non-Israeli Jews or of attacking Jews or, for that matter, Israelis outside the Middle East. And, you know, if you're going to designate Hamas as a terrorist organization, well, if you're going to do that on the basis that Hamas has targeted civilians for political purposes, which indisputably it has, then how can you designate Hamas as a terrorist organization, but not designate so many other organizations that are involved here, and certainly the Israeli state, and give it total impunity? I mean, you know, how can you at the same time allow charitable contributions to what, by the same standard, are indisputably terrorist organizations, additionally engaging in willful and premeditated violations of international law, such as promoting settlements in the occupied territories and supporting settler violence and pogroms against Palestinians in the occupied territories? You know, if I can just take a moment in
Go ahead,
response
please.
to your previous question, I think a key issue here is in the year 2000, the European Union signed what is known as an association agreement with Israel. Now, this agreement gives Israel preferential trade privileges with the European Union and it's the European market. It allows Israel to participate in all kinds of EU research and development programs, even though Israel is not an EU member. But Article 2 of this association agreement explicitly conditions Israel's privileges under this association agreement on its respect for its human rights obligations. And since 2000 until this very moment, the EU has never sought to invoke Article 2 to eliminate or even suspend any of Israel's privileges under this agreement. In other words, the EU's formal position is either that, as far as Brussels is concerned, Israel has never engaged in any significant violations of Palestinian human rights, or that despite the voluminous reporting and information at its disposal, the EU is too stupid to know whether or not Israel has or has not been violating Palestinian human rights. And the real scandal here is that last week, the European Union announced that it was conducting a review of Israel's compliance with its human rights obligations. Now, many people lauded and applauded this move. I think it's a genuine scandal that after everything that has happened, you actually need to conduct a review to figure out the obvious. The only conclusion I can make is that this is camouflage for continuing to conduct business as usual.
Which brings me to my next question, and my listeners rather, are already calling, but please let me just ask Mouin one more question before they, like my co-host, they take over the show once I open up the lines. We've had, since October 7th, so October 7th happened. Yes, it was a tragedy, you know, innocent people died, but immediately after October 7th, something incredible happened that nobody would have ever expected. Certainly not even me, who have known about this since I was a child. Everybody started learning about Palestine and the Palestinian liberation, especially and most importantly, young people, millennials, Gen Zs. They're educating their parents. They're even telling their grandparents. How could you not know about this? It really was shocking. Now, here's the thing. As a result of that, we've had protests, 500,000 in London, 100,000 at the Hague, and the numbers, and it doesn't stop. It's literally every week, every other week, and stuff. The people seem to be listening to the Palestinians. The civilians, ordinary people, seems to be hearing that this is wrong. Ordinary people seems to know right from wrong. At which point do we literally get bored with diplomacy? That's the only way I can put it nicely. Because what we hear is diplomacy from the UN. We hear diplomacy from the EU, the UK, US, and all of, even the Arab countries. Heck, we've had Piers Morgan, who has now been reborn this week, and one doesn't know whether to believe him or just keep it moving. You have all these people who have found their conscience, and they're still talking diplomatic terms. At which point do we stop doing diplomacy and literally say, you know what, get on with it, stop this?
Well, precisely so. Let me just say, I never for a moment believed that in my lifetime I would see this global outpouring of support for Palestinian rights and opposition to Israeli crimes that we've seen during the past year and a half, 2 years. I mean, I remember the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the Sabra Shatila massacres, the first Intifada, the second Intifada, the previous Israeli onslaughts on the Gaza Strip in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021. None of them generated anything remotely like what we've been seeing the past 2 years. And the most interesting thing is, yes, of course, Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, all of them are participating in this movement. But what is so telling is that it doesn't have an ethnic identity. It's like the anti-apartheid movement of the 1980s. It was led not by South Africans or Africans, although of course they did play a prominent. It was led by, as you quite correctly noted, ordinary people who know right from wrong, people of conscience. And it has also included a disproportionately large number of Jews of conscience, including in its leadership. And that, I think, has also been particularly telling, because while Israel has become a genocidal society, Jews who live in the West tend to be on the liberal end of the spectrum rather than on the conservative end of the spectrum. And for them, they can no longer reconcile their liberal values with Israel's explicitly fascist government and its genocidal apartheid conduct.
Thank you. Hello. Oops, sorry, call back. I'm so sorry. You can all call now. Right? You oh, okay. There is nobody there. Hello. I don't know what keeps happening. Yes. Oh, Titilope. Yes.
Norway and some other European countries are proposing a new Arab summit.
Sorry, start again, Titilope, and make it short, please.
Spain, Norway, and some other European countries are proposing a new Arab summit to be including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and co, in order to resurrect the two-state solution. Now, you see Israel yesterday, they are now pushing back to that by having additional settlement, 22 settlements in West Bank.
Yes.
Which already is internationally illegal. So what is his opinion? Does he think this is going to see the light of the day, given the background that the two-state solution has already been cancelled by the Abraham Accord?
Okay. Thank you very much.
I had difficulty hearing that.
Right. So basically what he's saying is that given that everybody's now talking sanctions, I'll give you this, and then they're already calling. Given that, we're now hearing about sanctions from France, from Greece, from everywhere, Israel is now talking. So everybody's asking for the two-state solution. However, Israel has made another step to scupper it by approving 22 more settlements. Hold on to that, and I'll answer this. Hello.
Yeah, good evening, Sisiogi.
Good evening. Make it short and sharp, man. No, we don't have time.
Yeah, I believe we will have more Yayan Sinwa in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And any logical person including the Israeli at the top level in the government, they will know with what has happened so far in Gaza. Do you think they will feel safe having the Palestinians, in Gaza because of because you can't expect.
I need you. You're making a statement. I need to know your question, please.
Yeah,
I don't have time.
Do you think the Israeli will be safe? They will.
Okay, will they have peace
in the future?
Okay.
Having the Palestinians in Gaza, in spite of everything they've done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you for that. Right, I'll answer this one. Bear with me.
I'm going to unfortunately have to ask you again because I'm having.
I will tell you. Don't worry. I'll tell you.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello, Godman here.
Godman, make it short, make it sharp, quickly. Thank you.
So, Hamas wants to remove they don't want to be termed as terrorists. I noticed the mood of Hamas. They don't consider civilians when they go in the operation, like we see in October 7. But Israel, on the other hand, will always want civilians, like we're coming in for this. And they try as much as possible to go for the major targets, which is the Hamas leaders in the executions. So I want to ask him, does he think, why is it that Hamas never have consideration for civilians like the Israelis would do when they want to go on mission? Thank you.
Right, so you have three questions there. The first one, Emmanuel was asking, how does Israel expect to be safe if they continue to do what they're doing in Gaza and for the Gazans to remain where they are? That's the second question. This particular question is, he noticed that Hamas don't seem to care about civilians when they are, taking their action, unlike Israel, who cares about civilians.
Yes.
Over to you. So I'm going to rush you because I'm running out of time, but go ahead. Mouin.
Well, the short answer to the last question is if there was any basis to the belief that Israel is in any way fighting Palestinians with even the slightest regard for international law and certainly the slightest regard for civilian life, it wouldn't now be having to answer for its actions at the International Court of Justice on charges of genocide. And in fact, there is, the South Africans provided in their case voluminous evidence that Israel is acting with genocidal intent to destroy a society and the people. And Israel has killed more journalists than in any other conflict, more medical workers than in any other conflict, more children than in any other conflict. It has bombed every single hospital in the Gaza Strip. It has demolished the healthcare sector. And I could go on and on and on. But this idea that Israel fights with the slightest regard for civilians is basically a pipe dream of Israel flunkies and apologists.
Okay.
Regarding the question about settlements, Israel, when it announced that it intends to establish 22 new settlements in the West Bank yesterday, if you look at the statements of Israeli leaders, this was not just about Lebensraum. They were explicitly stating that they are establishing these settlements in order to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. So the idea that there can be a two-state settlement with a genocidal apartheid regime that is addicted to expansionism, to war, to settler colonialism, to apartheid, I think is no longer on the agenda. And I think Israel needs to be dealt with in the same manner that other apartheid and genocidal regimes have been dealt with in the past, whether in the former Rhodesia or South Africa or, in Europe or Southeast Asia with the Khmer Rouge. And the first question, I heard a proposal for another Arab summit.
Yes.
I would only respond that that is a complete waste of time. The Arab states have demonstrated on a daily basis for almost 2 years that they are simply not going to act in defense of either Palestinian or, for that matter, Arab national interests.
So let me do, before I answer the next call, as you talked, there's talk of the two-state solution now. It goes on and on and on. It gets repeated. We've heard it 100 times. Before October 7th, I remember a senior UN, one of the the first to resign from the UN as a result of this, whose name skips my mind right now. He literally said that the two-state solution was known in the UN as a joke or something like that. Like, forget that. It's never going to. Thank you so much. There you go. That it's never going to happen. Now we have pretty much every so-called friend of Palestine, country is now demanding for the UN. However, you get the likes of Ilan Pape, Miko Peled, even other Palestinian activists who are Palestinians, who are from Palestine. And they're saying, what about a one-state solution? Because how are you going to get to a two-state solution when you have Gaza and then you have to cross over from Israel to get to the West Bank? And now you've expanded all the settlements. As of the time the two-state solution was on, there was only a few settlements. Now you have over 700,000.
Well, as someone who has supported a two-state settlement, I would say that I disagree with you insofar as implementing a two-state settlement is not a technical matter, but a political one.
Okay.
And it requires a sufficient mobilization of political will to compel Israel to withdraw to the 1967 boundaries. Of course, there is a real fear, that the Gaza Strip, rather than becoming a Palestinian or a Singapore of the Middle East, will become Soweto on the Mediterranean or a Palestinian Bangladesh. That's all entirely true. But this two-state settlement is no longer on the agenda of informed people. I mean, I was giving earlier the example of these statements by the European Union, which essentially serve as camouflage to continue business as usual. And I think when you see foreign officials expressing support for a two-state settlement while doing nothing to bring it about in practice, refusing even to recognize Palestinian statehood, let alone do anything in respect of the ICJ resolution on the illegality of the occupation, then you understand that, as Craig Mokhaiber rightly said, this is nothing more than a charade to divert our attention from what is really happening on the ground.
Thank you. Let me answer. I'm coming to your calls now. Hello? Hello? You need to turn off your radio, please. We can't hear you.
I've done it immediately.
Okay, thank you. Your name, where you're calling from, and short question, please.
My name is Prince Y.S. calling you from Abu Dhabi.
Go ahead.
My question goes this way. Is the United Nations still remain cater for the whole world? The Palestine, if that Gaza is developed, will they allow the Palestinians to remain there as a resident, or is it going to be occupied by the Israelis?
Okay, thank you.
And
the question is, if Gaza is developed, would they allow the Palestinians to remain there, or would they give it to the Israelis? Let me answer this call. Hello?
Yeah,
go ahead.
So quickly.
Yes.
I just want to ask, why are the distant cousins, or maybe the neighbors of Palestine, the Arabs, why are they not standing up? Why all of a sudden they just cowed? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's a question about the Arab countries. Why are they not doing anything? Why are they such cowards? I'm going to give you 2 minutes to answer that, or a minute and a half.
Well, I think on the last question, we have to make a clear distinction between the Arab peoples and their governments and regimes. And you may recall that over the past decade or two, we've had upheaval throughout this region. And this has made governments even more sensitive about any popular protest and more determined to repress it than they have been previously. Regarding the governments, we've already discussed that. I won't get into it any further. Regarding, I think the question was about who will
they allow the Palestinians to live on Gaza?
Proposal.
Yes.
Yes. Well, first of all, that harebrained proposal is never going to be implemented. And second of all, it was made explicit that Palestinians would not only be exiled, but permanently exiled. So that's my answer to that question.
Okay, the line is gone. We've only got, I can give you like a minute to talk to us. Talk to us about the Palestinian resistance, how they resist, why that resistance is so important, and what we as a people, as humans, what humanity needs to learn from the Palestinian resistance?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that Palestinian resistance comes in multiple forms by multiple organizations and multiple groups. And I think it's vitally important to learn or to understand that this resistance will continue as long as Israeli oppression continues. Are all of its actions always legitimate? Of course not. That's never the case with any struggle for freedom. But the struggle is a fundamentally legitimate one based on legitimate grievances in the pursuit of legitimate national rights, and will continue until those rights are achieved.
Indeed. Right. I do have a minute, but if you have to be very quickly, if you want to speak to Irene, I've tried to squeeze in as much as possible, but you have to be very, very, very quick. Otherwise, I'm going to take the time for myself because I haven't run out of my questions. Okay, let's talk about Ehud Olmert, who has now said Israel is committing war crimes. How big a deal is that? There's other ones, I can't remember his name, who has also come out. How big a deal is that? And Israel is turning against each other. These are people in the government.
I mean, when you talk about Olmert or Piers Morgan, it's rats jumping off a sinking ship, if you will. And, Olmert should know he launched the first war against the Gaza Strip in 2008, 2009. And I think people are also looking with one eye to the future and the certainty in their view that there will be more genocide and war crimes prosecution. And they're seeking also to salvage their own reputations. But the fact that a former Israeli head of government is now saying so, it's been obvious for so long, but nevertheless, I think it is enormously politically significant.
Mouin, Rabbani. Oh, did I pronounce your name right?
You did.
Yes, I did.
Yes.
Thank you so much. You've got to come back again. I know the lines are still going. No, really, thank you. Thank you for opening up your mind, your world, your knowledge, and sharing it with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be with you.
Have a great weekend.
You too. Goodbye.
Solidarity.
Thank you.
99.3 Nigeria Info. We are more than just radio. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Nigeria Info FM. Check us out on Facebook at Nigeria Info 99.3. Follow us on Twitter at Nigeria Info FM and on Instagram at Nigeria Info FM Lagos for live updates as it happens. 99.3 Nigeria Info. Let's